Are you planning a trip to Amsterdam? Or have you ever wondered what this incredible city looked like 100 years ago? Today, we are taking you on a journey through time, from the Roaring Twenties all the way to the present day. How did Amsterdam look, feel, and sound through the decades? And what are the biggest changes that shaped this city into what it is today? Sit back, relax, and let's start our journey. Enjoy! But first, let's set the scene. Amsterdam, the capital of the Netherlands, located in the heart of Western Europe, right on the North Sea coast. Today, Amsterdam is home to around 930,000 people, making it one of the most densely populated cities in Europe. It has over 165 nationalities living within its borders, making it one of the most diverse cities on the planet. The city is built on 90 islands, connected by 1,500 bridges, and crossed by 100 kilometers of canals, which is why it is often called the Venice of the North. Amsterdam is home to world-class museums like the Rijksmuseum and the Van Gogh Museum, a thriving creative and tech scene, and one of the busiest airports in Europe. It is a city of bicycles, with more bikes than people, a city of tolerance, creativity, and history, and a city that has changed enormously over the past 100 years. Are you ready to dive into that history? Let's go! Amsterdam in the 1920s was a city of contrasts. After the hardships of the First World War, which the Netherlands managed to avoid as a neutral country, the 20s brought a wave of optimism and energy. The city was growing fast. New neighborhoods were being built to the south and west as thousands of people moved in from the countryside looking for work. The canals were still the arteries of the city, wooden barges loaded with goods moving slowly between the merchant houses. Horse-drawn trams shared the cobblestone streets with the first automobiles. The famous Albert Koop market was already buzzing, and the cafes and jazz clubs of the Leidseplein were full of life every night. Amsterdam in the 1920s was a city on the move. The 1930s brought the Great Depression, and Amsterdam felt it deeply. Unemployment rose sharply, poverty spread through the working-class neighborhoods, and the mood of the city grew darker. The famous Jordaan neighborhood, home to Amsterdam's working class, saw strikes and riots in 1934 as residents protested against cuts to unemployment benefits. But even in difficult times, the city continued to build. The Amsterdamse Bos, the Great Urban Forest, was created in this period, partly as a work project for the unemployed. And as the decade drew to a close, the threat of Nazi Germany cast its shadow ever closer. By the end of the 1930s, Amsterdam had taken in thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Germany. The city sensed what was coming and feared it. The 1940s were the darkest decade in Amsterdam's modern history. In May 1940, Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands, and Amsterdam fell within days. What followed was 5 years of occupation that left deep and permanent scars on the city. The Jewish community of Amsterdam, once 80,000 strong and one of the oldest in Europe, was almost entirely destroyed. Over 100,000 Dutch Jews were deported to the Nazi death camps. Among them were a young girl named Anne Frank and her family, who hid for 2 years in a secret annex on the Prinsengracht before being betrayed and arrested in 1944. The hunger winter of 1944 to 1945 brought starvation to the city. Residents burned their furniture for warmth and ate tulip bulbs to survive. And then, in May 1945, came liberation. Canadian soldiers entered Amsterdam to scenes of extraordinary joy, and a city that had survived but would never be the same. The 1950s were a decade of rebuilding, not just of buildings, but of lives, communities, and confidence. Amsterdam embraced the post-war optimism with energy. New housing estates were built in the west and south of the city to house a growing population. The first television sets appeared in Dutch living rooms. Trolley buses replaced the old horse trams, and a new generation of Amsterdammers grew up in a city that was slowly, carefully, finding its feet again. The port of Amsterdam was one of the busiest in Europe, and the city's economy was growing steadily. It was a quieter, more settled Amsterdam than the turbulent decades before, a city catching its breath and looking forward. The 1960s transformed Amsterdam into something entirely new. The city became the epicenter of a cultural revolution that sent shockwaves across Europe. The Provos, a group of anarchist activists, staged happenings and protests that challenged everything from the royal family to the car culture that was beginning to dominate the city's streets. Their white bicycle plan, proposing free communal bikes for all, was decades ahead of its time. Hippies from across Europe and America descended on Amsterdam, drawn by its reputation for tolerance and freedom. The Vondelpark became an open-air living room, and the city began to develop the liberal social policies on drugs, on sexuality, on personal freedom that would define its international reputation for the next half-century. Amsterdam in the 1960s was electric. The 1970s were turbulent. The squatters movement, krakers, occupied empty buildings across the city to protest against housing shortages and property speculation, sometimes clashing violently with police. The coronation of Queen Beatrix in 1980, right on the edge of the decade, was met with riots in the streets as squatters used it as a focal point for their protests. But the 1970s were also a decade of important social progress. Gay rights, women's rights, and environmental awareness all advanced significantly in Amsterdam during these years. The city was changing fast, and not always comfortably, but it was changing in ways that would make it, in many respects, a more open and more equal place. The 1980s began in crisis. Unemployment was high. The heroin epidemic was devastating parts of the city, and Amsterdam's international image was suffering. The red light district had expanded, and parts of the city center felt unsafe and neglected. But out of that difficult period came an extraordinary burst of creativity. The music scene, the art scene, and the club culture that emerged from Amsterdam in the 1980s were genuinely world-class, and the city began the long process of urban renewal, cleaning up the canals, restoring the historic buildings, and reimagining what Amsterdam could be. By the end of the decade, the turnaround was visible. Amsterdam was finding its confidence again. The 1990s were Amsterdam's renaissance. The economy boomed, tourism exploded. The historic canal ring was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Schiphol Airport became one of the busiest in Europe. The tech sector began to establish itself in the city, the seeds of what would become one of Europe's great startup ecosystems. Amsterdam became fashionable again, a destination not just for backpackers and hippies, but for design lovers, food enthusiasts, and creative professionals from around the world. In the build-up to the millennium, the city buzzed with the energy of the dot-com boom, establishing a world-class digital infrastructure that cemented its position as a leading capital of the new online world. And as the millennium approached, Amsterdam looked ahead with confidence and excitement. The 2000s brought growth, and with it, new challenges. Tourism continued to rise steeply. The city's population became ever more international and diverse. New neighborhoods like the Eastern Docklands were transformed from industrial wasteland into some of the most innovative and desirable living spaces in Europe. The North-South Metro Line, one of the most ambitious and most troubled infrastructure projects in Dutch history, was under construction beneath the city, causing sinkholes and subsidence that made headlines around the world. And the political climate shifted. The assassinations of Pim Fortuyn in 2002 and Theo van Gogh in 2004 shocked the Netherlands and raised difficult questions about integration, identity, and free speech that Amsterdam was at the center of. The 2000s brought a new and unexpected problem: too much success. Amsterdam became one of the most visited cities in Europe, and the sheer volume of tourists began to overwhelm parts of the city. The historic center filled with souvenir shops and tourist restaurants. Housing prices soared as Airbnb listings multiplied. Residents began leaving the city center, pushed out by noise, crowds, and unaffordable rents. The city responded with new policies, limiting short-term rentals, banning stag parties in the red light district, closing coffee shops to tourists. Amsterdam was wrestling, for the first time, with what it meant to be too popular, and trying to find a way to remain a city for the people who actually lived there. And so we arrive at the present. Amsterdam today is a city of almost 1 million people, creative, diverse, ambitious, and still wrestling with many of the questions that have defined it throughout its history. The COVID pandemic of 2020 brought the city to a standstill. The canals empty, the museums closed, the streets silent in a way nobody had ever seen before. But Amsterdam recovered, the tourists returned, and the city continued to evolve. Today, Amsterdam is investing heavily in sustainability, cycling infrastructure, green energy, and the adaptation of its famous canal system to rising water levels. It is a city that knows its history, values its freedom, and is trying, carefully, to build a future that works for everyone who calls it home. 100 years on from the 1920s, Amsterdam is still, in every sense, very much alive. And that was Amsterdam, 100 years of history, change, struggle, and reinvention. From the horse-drawn trams of the 1920s to the electric bikes and high-rises of today, this city has never stopped moving forward. But now, we want to hear from you. Which decade of Amsterdam would you most like to have lived in? The creative freedom of the 1960s, the post-war optimism of the 1950s, or perhaps the energy of Amsterdam today? Drop your answer in the comments below, we would love to know. And if you enjoyed this journey through time, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe so you never miss a new video from Travel Destinations Cinematic. Until next time, safe travels everyone.